Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. I hadn't seen my brother in 10 years. The last time I did, he was being dragged out of our father's house, screaming curses at me and the woman who gave birth to me. Now, as I stood at the entrance of that same house, staring at the wreck of a man he had become, I wondered if things could have turned out differently, if he had chosen to love instead of hate. But some wounds never heal, and some choices can never be undone. Chief Patrick was a man who commanded respect wherever he went. His wealth was evident in the way he carried himself, in the grand mansion he owned, and in the businesses that bore his name. But beyond his wealth, he was known for one thing, his love for his son, Timmy. Timmy was not just his first son, he was his pride, his joy, and for a long time, the only child who bore his name. From the moment Timmy was born, Chief Patrick made sure he lacked nothing. If Timmy pointed at something, it became his. Expensive clothes, the latest toys, and even things a child his age had no use for. His father provided them all. Servants catered to his every need, teachers were handpicked to give him the best education, and every birthday was a lavish affair, attended by the most influential people in town. It was no secret that Timmy was spoiled. He did not need to ask twice for anything, and even when he misbehaved, his father's discipline was light, almost playful. His mother, Adaora, was a beautiful woman who, like her son, enjoyed the privileges of Chief Patrick's wealth. She had married him young, when he was still building his empire, and as his fortunes grew, so did her love for comfort. She was elegant, always dressed in the finest fabrics, with a sharp tongue that made servants fear her. But while she indulged in luxury, her attention to her son was inconsistent. She was there, yet absent, a mother who showed affection when it suited her, and disappeared when it didn't. But none of that mattered to Timmy, because his father was all the love he needed. For years, their home remained the same, a place where Timmy reigned as the sole heir, where his father's world revolved around him, and where no one dared to challenge his place. Then, whispers began to spread. Servants exchanged glances behind closed doors, speaking in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. Timmy noticed that his father became restless, often sitting in silence with a deep frown on his face. His mother, once carefree, began to act strangely. She was more irritable, snapping at the help for no reason. Sometimes she would leave the house for hours and return looking shaken. Something was wrong, but Timmy did not understand what. Then, one night, his father called for a family meeting. He sat in the grand living room, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping the wooden armrest of his chair. His mother sat across from him, her face pale. Timmy, barely 10 years old, sat between them, confused. What happened next would change everything. Chief Patrick, in a voice that was both calm and terrifying, announced that Adaora would be leaving. There was no warning, no explanation, just a statement that left the air thick with tension. Timmy did not understand at first. Leave? To where? His mother, usually so fierce, said nothing. She looked at her husband with quiet resignation, as if she had known this moment was coming. And then, just like that, she was gone. Timmy screamed, cried, begged, but his father did not change his decision. Servants packed her things in silence, and by morning there was no trace of her left in the house. Days turned into weeks, and still no one spoke of her. Timmy's world felt colder, emptier. He asked questions, but his father gave him no answers. The servants averted their eyes whenever he mentioned her name. It was as if she had never existed. In the beginning, Chief Patrick softened towards his son, compensating for the loss with even more gifts and attention. But over time, something shifted. He became sterner, less tolerant of Timmy's tantrums, as if the absence of his wife had made him rethink the way he raised his son. The warmth he once carried seemed forced now, like he was trying to convince himself that spoiling Timmy was still the right thing to do. But Timmy clung to his father's love, believing that as long as it remained, nothing else mattered. His mother's absence hurt, but he was still the golden boy, the only son of Chief Patrick, and that was enough. Or so he thought. Timmy had never questioned his place in his father's life. Even after his mother's sudden departure, he believed nothing could truly change the bond they shared. Over the years, he settled into the new normal. His father busied himself with work, coming home late some nights, but Timmy remained the center of his attention. Whenever Chief Patrick was around, he still made sure Timmy had the best of everything. The household staff continued to obey his every whim, and there was no one to challenge his authority in the house. That was how it had always been. But something shifted when Timmy came home from school one afternoon and found a woman sitting in the living room. She was dressed simply in a soft-colored wrapper and blouse, her hair neatly tied back. Unlike the wealthy women Timmy was used to seeing at his father's gatherings, she did not wear heavy jewelry or expensive perfume. She sat with an ease that unsettled him, as if she belonged there. At first, he thought she was a visitor, perhaps a relative he had never met. He waited for her to leave, but as the evening stretched on, she remained. Servants brought her food, speaking to her with a familiarity that confused him. When his father finally came home, the woman greeted him with a quiet smile, and his father responded in a tone that was softer than Timmy had ever heard. Something about the exchange made his stomach tighten. He did not know who she was, but instinct told him she was not just passing through. Days passed, and the woman did not leave. At first, Timmy tried to ignore her presence, pretending she did not exist, but it was impossible. She was everywhere, in the kitchen, in the garden, even in his father's study. The servants now answered to her, moving quickly to fulfill her requests. She was not demanding or harsh, but there was a quiet authority about her, as if she had already claimed her place. Timmy hated it. One evening, unable to hold back any longer, he asked his father why she was still here. Chief Patrick, who had been reading a newspaper, barely looked up as he answered, "Her name is Ifeoma. She is my wife now." The words hit Timmy like a slap. He stared at his father, waiting for him to take it back, to say it was a joke. But there was no amusement in his father's eyes. Ifeoma was not a guest. She was permanent. Timmy stormed off, his mind racing. How could his father remarry without telling him? Without preparing him? He had not been given a choice, had not been asked how he felt. The thought of sharing his home, of having to acknowledge this woman as part of his family, made his skin crawl. His mother had barely been gone for 8 years, and now she was being replaced. The worst part was that Ifeoma did not try to force herself into his life. She did not attempt to mother him or shower him with unwanted affection. Instead, she gave him space, which only made him angrier. Her calmness felt like an insult, like she did not care whether he accepted her or not. As if things weren't bad enough, a year later, Timmy was woken up one morning by the sound of a crying baby. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening as the wails echoed through the house. It took him a moment to realize where the sound was coming from, his father's bedroom. The realization made his stomach churn. He did not need to ask what had happened. He already knew. His father had a new child, a son. The truth settled over him like a heavy weight. This was not just about Ifeoma anymore. This was about Tobe, a boy who would grow up in the same house, under the same roof. A boy who would take up space, demand attention, and, worst of all, steal the love that had once belonged to him alone. Timmy clenched his fists, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cries that had no idea what they had already taken from him. In that moment, he realized something. His world was no longer his own, and for the first time in his life, he felt the sting of being replaced. Timmy could not remember the exact moment his resentment fully took root, but it must have been sometime after Tobe learned how to walk. At first, the baby was just a crying nuisance in the background, something he could ignore if he tried hard enough. But then Tobe started moving, exploring every corner of the house, touching things that had once belonged only to Timmy. The servants, who had once answered solely to him, now rushed to attend to the child, cooing over his every step, laughing at his babbling. Even Chief Patrick, a man who had once given his undivided attention to his firstborn, now spent more time with Ephioma and their son. Timmy would sit in silence, watching his father hold the toddler in his arms, watching as he laughed with a softness that felt foreign. It was the kind of laughter that used to be reserved for him. Something deep inside Timmy curdled. At first, he told himself it was just annoyance, that he was not truly bothered by Tobe's existence, but the feeling never went away. It only grew, twisting into something darker. Ephioma, to her credit, never tried to provoke him. She never scolded him when he ignored her greetings, never forced him to acknowledge her son. Instead, she gave him space, perhaps hoping he would come around on his own. But to Timmy, her patience felt like mockery. It was as if she knew she had already won, as if she was secure in her position as Chief Patrick's wife, as if nothing he did could change that. Timmy responded in the only way he knew how, by making himself impossible to ignore. He started misbehaving more, testing his father's limits in ways he never had before. If his father asked him to do something, he would refuse outright. If Ephioma was in the room, he would knock things over as he passed, just to see if she would react. When Tobe's cries echoed through the house, he would turn up the volume on the television, drowning out the noise. He pushed and pushed, waiting for the moment Ephioma would snap, for the moment she would yell at him, tell him he was a spoiled brat, prove to everyone that she was not as kind as she pretended to be. But she never did. Instead, she remained calm, her face unreadable. What Timmy did not know, what he never realized, was that Ephioma spoke to his father in private, always interceding on his behalf. She told Chief Patrick to be patient, to understand that Timmy was still adjusting. She defended him when the servants complained about his behavior, insisting that he was just a boy struggling to find his place. She never told Timmy this. He never saw the way she fought for him behind closed doors, never heard the way she reminded his father that Timmy was still his first son. All he saw was that no matter how much trouble he caused, his father's anger toward him only grew, while Ephioma remained untouched, as if she was above it all. It made his hatred burn even hotter. As the years passed, the divide in the house became impossible to ignore. Tobe grew into a quiet, observant boy who seemed to understand things without being told. He never openly challenged Timmy, never fought back when his older brother snapped at him. And yet everything about him irritated Timmy. The way their father praised him for the smallest achievements, the way he worked hard at school, the way he never had to demand attention because it was simply given to him. Timmy, on the other hand, could feel himself slipping further away from his father's approval. He did not care about school, barely paid attention to his studies, and whenever his father tried to talk to him about his future, he responded with silence or defiance. The more Chief Patrick scolded him, the more stubborn he became, and with every passing year, the gap between father and son widened. Ephioma, despite everything, continued to treat Timmy with kindness, but he saw it for what it was, pity. He wanted nothing from her. He wanted nothing from any of them. And yet, deep inside, he longed for the days when things had been simple, when he had been enough. But those days were gone. Now, he was just a shadow of the son he used to be. Timmy was 16 when he first felt the sting of true isolation in his own home. He had always known that things were shifting, that his father was growing more impatient with him, that the servants no longer jumped at his commands the way they once had. But he had convinced himself it was temporary, that one day Chief Patrick would remember who his first son was, that everything would go back to how it used to be. That illusion shattered one evening during dinner. It was a quiet night, the only sounds in the dining room coming from the soft clatter of cutlery against fine china. Timmy sat at the far end of the long table, watching as his father spoke to Tobe about school. It was the same conversation every night: what subjects he enjoyed, what books he was reading, how his teachers praised him. Timmy had learned to tune it out, staring blankly at his plate, pretending not to care. But that night, something was different. "Tobe is excelling in his studies," Chief Patrick said, his voice carrying a pride Timmy hadn't heard directed at him in years. "His teachers say he has a natural talent for leadership." The words were a blade, cutting deeper than Timmy wanted to admit. He kept his face neutral, shoving a piece of meat into his mouth, chewing without tasting. Then, without looking up, he muttered, "Must be nice to have everyone fawn over you." The room fell silent. Ifeoma's gaze flickered toward him, concerned. Toby shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But it was Chief Patrick's reaction that made Timmy's chest tighten. He simply sighed and went back to eating, as if his son's bitterness wasn't worth addressing. That was when Timmy realized something painful. His father had stopped trying. In the past, Chief Patrick would have scolded him, would have reminded him of his responsibilities, would have tried to pull him back in line. Now, he barely acknowledged him. It was as if he had grown tired of the battle, as if he had already decided that Timmy was a lost cause. The realization made Timmy's blood boil. He clenched his fists under the table, but there was nothing he could do. He had spent years rebelling, pushing his father away, trying to make a statement. But now that he had succeeded, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like being discarded. Over the next few months, things only got worse. Timmy started skipping school, roaming the streets with boys his father would never approve of. He stayed out late, sometimes not coming home until the early hours of the morning. When he did return, no one questioned him. The servants barely acknowledged his presence, and his father, once so involved in every detail of his life, had stopped waiting up for him. The only person who ever showed concern was Ifeoma. She never confronted him, never nagged, but he often caught her watching him with quiet worry, as if she knew he was slipping through the cracks and didn't know how to stop it. But Timmy didn't care. If no one else wanted him, then he would make sure they regretted it. One night, after another argument with his father, this time about money he had borrowed without permission, Timmy stormed out of the house and didn't return until dawn. His head was heavy from cheap alcohol, his clothes reeking of cigarettes and sweat. As he stumbled through the front door, he expected to be met with another round of scolding, expected his father to demand an explanation. Instead, he found Ifeoma waiting for him in the living room, a cup of tea in her hands. She didn't look angry. She didn't look disappointed. She just looked tired. "Timmy," she said softly, setting the cup down. "You can keep running, but it won't change the fact that you're still his son." He let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Am I?" His voice was hoarse. "Because it feels like he's already replaced me." Ifeoma opened her mouth as if to respond, but then she closed it again, as if realizing there was nothing she could say that he would believe. So instead, she just sighed and stood up, walking past him without another word. And for the first time, Timmy felt something close to regret, but it was fleeting, drowned out by the anger that had already consumed him. Timmy no longer recognized the boy he used to be. There was a time when he walked through his father's house with certainty, when he knew that every door would open for him, that every voice would answer when he called. But now, he was a stranger in his own home. The servants no longer rushed to do his bidding. They avoided him, their gazes wary, their movements careful, as if afraid that one wrong word would ignite his already short temper. Even the house itself felt different, colder, quieter. The air was thick with an unspoken truth, one that Timmy refused to acknowledge. He had spent so long fighting to keep his father's attention, but it had been wasted effort. Chief Patrick had already given up on him. That fact sat heavy in his chest, suffocating him. Every day he watched as his father and Tobe grew closer, as Ifeoma moved effortlessly through a life that should have been his mother's. He told himself that it didn't matter, that he didn't need them. But late at night, when the world was silent and he was left alone with his thoughts, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something worse, an emptiness that he didn't know how to fill. His father's patience had long since run out. At first, Chief Patrick had tried to guide him, to discipline him, to remind him of what was expected of a son from their family. But Timmy had resisted at every turn, his defiance growing sharper with each passing year. Now, there was nothing left between them but exhaustion and resentment. Conversations had turned into orders, and orders had turned into silence. Leafioma was the only one who still made an effort, but even she was running out of words to say. One evening, after another long absence, Timmy returned home to find his father waiting for him in the study. The room smelled of old books and expensive whiskey, the dim glow of the lamp casting deep shadows across Chief Patrick's face. He didn't speak immediately, just watched his son with the same expression he always had these days, disappointment masked by indifference. "Where were you?" His voice was calm, too calm. Timmy shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Out." His father exhaled sharply, setting his glass down on the mahogany desk. "Out where?" "Why do you care?" Timmy shot back. "It's not like you've ever asked before." A muscle twitched in Chief Patrick's jaw, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he reached into his drawer and pulled out a small stack of papers. He placed them on the desk and pushed them toward Timmy. "These," he said, his voice steady, "are your last chances." Timmy frowned, stepping closer. He picked up the papers, flipping through them. School fees, debts, reports from his teachers, warnings from the authorities. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. His father leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the wood. "I've spent years trying to fix your mistakes, covering for you, paying for the damage you caused, but I won't do it anymore." Timmy felt a sharp pang of panic, but he masked it with defiance. "So what? You're finally cutting me off?" His father's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, Timmy. I'm giving you a choice. Either you fix this, or you leave this house." The words hit harder than Timmy expected. He had always known this moment was coming, but he never thought his father would actually follow through. For years, he had tested the limits, pushed as hard as he could, waiting for someone to pull him back. But now, standing in that dimly lit room, he realized that no one would. Not anymore. He looked down at the papers again, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could fix this, go back to school, straighten out his life, do what his father had always wanted. But when he thought about Tobe, about the way their father looked at him with pride, something bitter clawed its way up his throat. Would fixing his life change anything? Or would he still be nothing more than a disappointment? He dropped the papers onto the desk, his hands trembling. "I don't need your help," he muttered. His father didn't flinch. "Then leave." Timmy's breath caught in his chest, but Chief Patrick was already turning away, reaching for his whiskey as if the conversation was over. That was it. No anger. No begging. No second chances. Timmy's fingers curled into fists. He forced himself to turn around, to walk out of the room without looking back. But as he stepped into the hallway, a single thought echoed in his mind. He had finally lost. The night air was thick and heavy as Timmy stepped out of the house for what felt like the last time. He had left before, walked out in anger, spent days away only to return when hunger or exhaustion forced him back. But this time was different. There was no room left for his pride to stretch, no lingering sense of ownership over the house he had once called home. He stood in the driveway, staring at the iron gates ahead of him, feeling a hollowness he couldn't name. The streets beyond were silent, unfamiliar despite all the times he had roamed them. For years he had been the storm inside his father's house, pushing against walls that once felt impenetrable. But now, outside those walls, he felt smaller than he ever had before. He had expected rage to carry him forward, had convinced himself that he was leaving because he wanted to, not because he had been cast out. But as he walked down the road, away from the estate, his steps slowed. He had nowhere to go. The friends he had spent his nights with, boys who laughed too loudly, drank too much, and spent money they didn't have, would not take him in. Their loyalty had always been tied to what he could offer, the reckless fun he could afford. And now, with no safety net beneath him, he was just another stray. He wandered for hours, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him, until exhaustion forced him to stop. The cheap motel he found was barely more than a room with a bed and a flickering bulb overhead. He paid for 2 nights with what little money he had left, lying awake in the dark, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind was a mess of thoughts, all of them leading back to the same question: had his father truly stopped caring, or had he simply grown tired of waiting for Timmy to change? The thought made his chest ache in a way he wasn't ready to face. But more than anything, it made him angry. He told himself that he didn't need his father, didn't need that house. He would survive on his own, prove that he was more than just the disappointment they thought he was. Yet, as the days passed, reality sank its claws into him. He had no education, no skills, no real means of supporting himself. Each morning he woke up to the same uncertainty, his pride the only thing keeping him from returning home. Back at the estate, life continued without him. The servants went about their duties, the sun rose and fell over the compound, and his absence did not shake the walls as he had imagined it would. Ephioma noticed it the most, the silence that lingered in spaces Timmy used to fill with his anger. She still prepared an extra plate at dinner, only to remember he was no longer there. She still checked his room, as if expecting him to return, even though she knew better. But Chief Patrick barely spoke of him. He carried on as if nothing had changed, his focus fixed on Toba, on the future. If the loss of his first son affected him, he did not show it. And Tobe, though young, was old enough to understand that something was missing, even if he never spoke about it. The house did not mourn Timmy's departure. It simply adjusted, reshaped itself around the gap he had left behind. And perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. Timmy had always believed he was irreplaceable, but the world was proving otherwise. Timmy woke up to the sharp sting of sunlight filtering through the dirty motel curtains, his head heavy from the previous night's drinking. The room smelled of stale air and regret, the mattress beneath him stiff and unwelcoming. He sat up slowly, running a hand over his face, his stomach twisting with hunger. The last of his money had gone into the cheap bottles of alcohol he had used to silence his thoughts, and now there was nothing left, not even the energy to convince himself that he was in control. His phone lay face down on the bedside table, its screen cracked from when he had thrown it in anger days before. He had tried calling a few old friends, but their responses had been cold, distant. They owed him nothing, and now that he had nothing to offer, they saw no reason to keep him close. The realization stung, but not as much as the silence from his father. Not a single call, not a single message. He had thought his departure would shake the house, force his father to realize his mistake. But as the days stretched into weeks, it became painfully clear that he had overestimated his importance. By the time his stay at the motel ended, Timmy had no choice but to move to the streets. He wandered aimlessly through familiar neighborhoods, his pride keeping him from asking for help. Hunger gnawed at him. His clothes grew filthy, and the weight of his choices pressed harder with each passing day. He had always believed that his father's wealth had shielded him from the harsh realities of the world, that he would never truly suffer, no matter how far he fell. But reality had a cruel way of humbling a man. He found himself sleeping in abandoned buildings, sharing space with others who had nowhere to go. They spoke in hushed voices about their pasts, their mistakes, their regrets. For the first time in his life, Timmy was surrounded by people who had nothing, and he was one of them. The anger he had clung to for so long began to fade, replaced by something far more dangerous, self-pity. He thought about returning home more times than he could count, but the shame of it was unbearable. How could he walk through those gates, knowing he had failed? Would they even let him in? Or would his father's final words, "Then leave," still stand? One evening, as he sat outside a run-down eatery, watching people pass by, he caught a familiar face in the crowd. It was Tobe. His younger brother walked with quiet confidence, his school uniform neat, his books tucked under his arm. He looked taller than Timmy remembered, older, stronger. For a moment, Timmy considered calling out to him, but the thought vanished as quickly as it came. What would he even say? That he had wasted every opportunity while Tobe had worked for everything he had? That their father had been right all along? Shame burned in his throat as he lowered his head, hoping his brother wouldn't see him. But as Tobe walked past, his steps slowed. He turned slightly, as if sensing something familiar. His eyes scanned the street, pausing briefly in Timmy's direction. For a split second, Timmy thought their eyes met, but then, just as quickly, Tobe looked away and kept walking. And in that moment, Timmy understood something painful. He was no longer part of their world. He had made himself a stranger to his own family, and now he had no one left to blame but himself. Timmy had always thought of himself as someone who could survive anything. Even in his worst moments, he had carried an arrogant belief that, no matter how far he fell, he would never truly hit the ground. But now, after weeks of living without security, without certainty, he realized how little he truly understood about struggle. Hunger was not just an inconvenience, it was a weight that drained him, hollowed him out from the inside. Every morning, he woke up in whatever corner of the city he had found to sleep in, his stomach aching, his body weak. The nights were worse. The city became an unforgiving place when the sun went down. He learned quickly that people looked through him as if he were invisible, that pity was a rare commodity, and that desperation made a man consider things he never thought himself capable of. He stood outside restaurants, waiting for leftovers that might be thrown away. He searched for loose change on the ground, hoping for just enough to buy a piece of bread. The pride that once made him reject his father's warnings was slowly eroding, crumbling under the weight of reality. One afternoon, he found himself outside a mechanic's shop, watching the workers move with ease, their hands covered in grease as they repaired the cars that came through. They laughed, cursed, and wiped sweat from their brows, completely unaware of his presence. It had been years since Timmy had done anything that required effort, real effort. He had spent his life coasting on his father's wealth, believing that doors would always open for him simply because of who he was. But now, with no options left, he did something he never thought he would do. He stepped forward. The man in charge was an older mechanic, his face hardened by years of labor. He looked Timmy up and down, his gaze unreadable. His voice was rough, carrying the weight of skepticism. Timmy hesitated, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't look like you've worked a day in your life." Timmy felt shame creep up his spine, but he held his ground. "I can learn." The man studied him for a long moment before tossing a rag his way. "Clean the tools. If you're still here by the end of the day, we'll see." It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long time, Timmy had something to do. He scrubbed, he listened, he watched. The work was exhausting, but exhaustion was better than aimless wandering. Days passed, then weeks. The mechanic's shop became the only place that made sense in his life. He was still an outsider, still the boy who had lost everything, but at least he had a reason to wake up in the morning. The pain of his past still clung to him, but here, no one knew who he was. No one cared about the son of Chief Patrick, the former golden child who had thrown his life away. He was just Timmy, a struggling man trying to make it through the day. But the past had a way of creeping up when least expected. One evening, as he was packing up, he heard a voice that made his stomach tighten. "Timmy?" He turned sharply, and there, standing a few feet away, was Tobe. His younger brother's eyes were wide, filled with emotions Timmy couldn't decipher. Shame hit him like a blow to the chest. He had imagined seeing Tobe again, but not like this. Not covered in grease, standing in the shadows of a life he had never meant to live. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Tobe stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Come home." The words were simple, but they cut through Timmy's defenses like a knife. He had spent so long telling himself that he had no place left in his family, but now, standing in front of the brother he had once resented, he realized he had a choice to make. Timmy stared at Tobe, feeling the weight of his younger brother's words settle deep in his chest. Come home. Two simple words, yet they carried the weight of everything he had lost. He wanted to say yes, to grab onto the lifeline being offered, but pride had built too many walls around him. His hands, rough and stained with oil from weeks of work, clenched at his sides. What would going home even mean? He had spent years believing that his father's house was his by right, that no matter what he did, he would always have a place there. Now, the thought of stepping through those gates filled him with unease. "Why are you here?" His voice came out hoarse, not as sharp as he had intended. Tobe, always calm, met his gaze without hesitation. "I asked around. I needed to find you." Timmy scoffed, looking away. "And why is that? Did Father send you to drag me back?" A flicker of something, hurt, maybe disappointment, crossed Tobe's face. "No, he doesn't even know I'm here." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the mechanic's shop faded into the background, drowned out by the pounding of Timmy's heart. He should have been angry, should have pushed his brother away just as he had done for years. But standing here, looking at Tobe, taller now, more sure of himself, Timmy felt something break inside him. This wasn't the little boy he used to push aside, the one he blamed for all his misfortunes. Tobe had become his own man, and unlike Timmy, he had fought for everything he had. "Why do you care?" The question came out quieter than Timmy intended. Tobe sighed, shifting on his feet. "Because no matter what you think, you're still my brother." The words stung more than they should have. Timmy had spent years convinced that his family had moved on without him, that he had been forgotten, replaced. But now, Tobe stood here, proving him wrong. The anger he had carried for so long felt heavy, almost pointless. What had it ever brought him, except ruin? He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "And if I don't come back?" Tobe's expression didn't change. "Then that's your choice. But don't say you weren't given a chance." The weight of those words settled between them. Timmy had spent so long blaming others for his downfall, refusing to acknowledge that he had been the one making the choices that led him here. And now, when faced with the chance to undo some of it, he realized just how afraid he was to take it. That night, Timmy lay awake in his small rented room, staring at the ceiling. The idea of returning home felt impossible. Would his father even acknowledge him? Would Fiona look at him with pity? He hated the thought of facing them, of seeing the disappointment in their eyes. But what was the alternative? More nights of hunger? More days of back-breaking labor, all leading nowhere? He had told himself that he would make it on his own, prove that he didn't need his father's wealth, but the truth was he had no real plan. He had been running on anger for so long, but anger didn't fill an empty stomach. Tobe's visit had cracked something in him, something he wasn't ready to face. But as the hours stretched on and the reality of his situation sank deeper, a single truth became clear. If he didn't go back now, he might never get another chance. The road home felt longer than ever, but for the first time in years, he considered taking it. Timmy stood at the entrance of Chief Patrick's compound, his breath shallow, his hands clammy. The gates loomed taller than he remembered, or maybe it was just that he felt smaller now. The last time he had been here, He had left with defiance in his steps, spitting anger at his father, convinced he would never need to return. Now, standing outside with nothing but the weight of his past on his shoulders, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a place he had abandoned, a life he had thrown away. He thought about turning back. He could return to the mechanic's shop, keep struggling, prove to himself, if no one else, that he didn't need this. But then he thought of Tobe. His brother had given him a chance, had reached out when no one else did. Timmy wasn't sure he deserved it, but for once, he wasn't going to let his pride make the decision. His legs felt heavy as he moved forward, pushing the gate open. The sound of metal creaking was deafening in the quiet morning air, and with each step he took inside, the memories hit him, good ones, painful ones, all tangled together. He barely made it to the front door before it swung open. Ephioma stood there, frozen, her eyes widening in shock. She looked just as he remembered, gentle features, kind eyes, the same quiet strength that had always unnerved him. He braced himself for anger, for scorn, for the cold rejection he had convinced himself she would give. But instead, she let out a sharp breath, her shoulders sagging. Timmy, his name came out as a whisper, like she had been holding it in for years. He didn't know what to say. Apologies felt too small, explanations too late. Before he could gather his thoughts, another voice rang out. "Who is—" Chief Patrick stepped into view, his gaze locking onto Timmy. The air in the room changed. Time stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Timmy's stomach twisted. He had expected many things, rage, disappointment, indifference, but the look in his father's eyes was something else entirely. It was exhaustion. The years had aged Chief Patrick, deepening the lines on his face, dulling the fire in his once commanding presence. Timmy swallowed hard. I faltered, unsure how to begin. He had never struggled for words before, but now, with everything at stake, nothing seemed enough. Then, to his surprise, Tobe appeared, stepping into the room with the same quiet confidence he had always carried. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Timmy saw something he had never truly recognized before, understanding. Tobe wasn't just the little brother he had resented, the boy he had seen as a rival for their father's love. He was a man who had walked his own path, who had earned everything through effort, who had found a way to carry the family name without being crushed by its weight. And despite everything, despite years of anger and distance, he had made room for Timmy. The realization settled deep in his chest, heavier than anything he had carried before. He turned back to Chief Patrick, his father still watching, still unreadable. Timmy inhaled sharply. I want to come home. The words felt foreign, almost fragile, but they were the only truth he had left. Silence stretched between them, the weight of past mistakes pressing down on all of them. And then, finally, his father exhaled, his gaze shifting ever so slightly, not softening, but no longer closed. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise of acceptance. But it was something. A chance. And for the first time in years, Timmy was ready to take it. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.